I am Elena, 32, watching my father officially hand my hard-earned CEO title to my brother under the Baccarat chandeliers. Before 300 silent guests, he adjusted his Patek Philippe and declared that true leadership requires a foundation of character that some branches of this family simply failed to grow. The cloying scent of lilies turned sharp as every eye in the ballroom focused on my solitary chair at table 42. I didn't flinch, my pulse remaining at a steady, clinical 60 beats per minute. Your debt is due. To understand why his empire is currently turning to dust, you must first see the grave he spent 30 years digging for me. Oakmont Manor was a fortress of silent expectations, where the air always felt 5 degrees colder than the world outside. During our mandatory Sunday dinners, the hierarchy was carved into the very seating chart of the 10-foot mahogany table. My father sat at the head, a king presiding over his small, eye-polished court, while Julian occupied the seat to his immediate right, bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandelier. I was relegated to the far end, positioned so close to the service door that I could smell the scorched butter from the kitchen and hear the frantic whispers of the staff. At 7 years old, I watched my father hand Julian a vintage compass for simply managing to sit still, while my perfect report card remained unopened beneath my napkin. It wasn't cruelty in his mind. It was a biological investment strategy. He saw a future in my brother's mediocre laughter, and only a functional shadow in my silent, meticulous presence. By the time I was 16, the patterns of my erasure had become the structural foundation of the household. My father's office was a sanctuary of tobacco and leather, where he taught Julian the mechanics of the family firm, explaining the nuances of hostile takeovers as if they were bedtime stories. I was never invited to sit, but I was often called to deliver tea or file papers that Julian found too tedious to organize. They would continue their conversations while I moved between the shelves, assuming my ears were as decorative as the wallpaper. What they didn't understand then was that invisibility granted me a front-row seat to their vulnerabilities. I recorded every skipped detail and every arrogant assumption they made about the market. My father believed he was protecting the legacy by focusing on the son he could mold, never realizing he was providing a masterclass in corporate warfare to the daughter he chose to ignore. The silence I maintained wasn't submission. It was data collection. In that house of cold stone and sharp corners, Aunt Clara was the only person who looked at me without looking through me. She was my father's younger sister, a woman he dismissed as a flighty eccentric because she chose to live in the quietest wing of the estate, surrounded by dusty ledgers and ancient maps. While my father and Julian were busy celebrating their loud, masculine victories, Clara would find me in the library and hand me a fountain pen or a specific book on economic history without saying a single word. Her hands always smelled of lavender and old ink, and her eyes held a terrifyingly sharp clarity that mirrored my own. Today, I understand that she wasn't just a relative. She was a strategist who saw my potential long before I did. She never offered me hollow comfort. Instead, she showed me how to read between the lines of a contract. She was the one who taught me that the person who holds the archives eventually holds the kingdom. June 14, 2018, was the day the temperature in the study hit 94 degrees. Yet my father wore his wool blazer as if the heat were beneath him. I remember the exact weight of the air, thick with the scent of cedar oil and the metallic tang of a fresh ink cartridge being loaded into his Montblanc Meisterstück. On the desk lay 84 separate transfer authorizations, each time-stamped and ready for the disbursement of the trust my grandmother had established specifically for my doctoral research in quantitative economics at Zurich. The figure was precise: $4,280,000. Julian was leaning against the mahogany bookshelf, picking at a loose thread on his $1,000 loafers, barely masking a smirk that bordered on predatory. My father didn't look up as he slid the document toward Julian, his signature already drying in a bold, aggressive stroke that effectively erased my academic future. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated reallocation of resources toward Julian's newest vanity project. A family is a single organism, Elena, and right now, the limb that needs the most blood is your brother's, my father said, finally meeting my gaze with the clinical detachment of a surgeon performing a necessary amputation. He spoke with the absolute moral authority of a man who believed that merit was a secondary concern to the preservation of a male-dominated lineage. He told me that my intellect was a tool that could be used anywhere, but Julian needed the capital to establish a presence in the social circles that mattered. Julian didn't even thank him. He simply tucked the papers into his briefcase and checked his Rolex, complaining that he was going to be late for a lunch at the club. I watched the clock on the mantel, a 19th-century French regulator, and listened to the rhythmic tick that felt like a countdown to my own disappearance. I didn't argue. Words were a currency I refused to spend on a transaction that had already been finalized in their hearts. I walked out of that study with nothing but my laptop, a single vintage suitcase, and the cold clarity of a woman who had just seen the true price of her loyalty. As I crossed the foyer, Aunt Clara stood by the grand staircase, her hands folded over a small, leather-bound ledger. She didn't offer a hug or a platitude. She simply caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, her expression holding the grim satisfaction of someone whose long-held theory had finally been proven correct. I left Oakmont Manor at 6:14 p.m., the sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the driveway as I hailed a cab to a cramped studio apartment in a district my father wouldn't visit. I had $1,200. The cab ride cost me $42, leaving me with $1,158 and a name I was determined to make them regret. Aunt Clara had slipped a brass key into my pocket, a key to a safe deposit box they had forgotten existed. The studio on 4th Street smelled of damp plaster and cheap detergent, a sensory assault that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, arid, lavender-scented halls of Oakmont Manor. I spent the first 3 weeks tracking every cent of my remaining $1,158 in a spiral notebook, accounting for 42-cent bus fares and $3 packs of generic pasta. The 19th century French regulator clock had been replaced by a digital alarm that blinked a relentless neon red at 4:05 a.m. every morning. I traded my charcoal silk suits for off-the-rack polyester blends that felt like sandpaper against my skin, but I wore them with the same rigid posture I had perfected at the mahogany table. My invisibility, once a source of humiliation, now became my most effective camouflage in the crowded subway cars where I studied market trends on a cracked smartphone screen. What my father hadn't understood was that by stripping me of my inheritance, he had inadvertently freed me from the burden of his expectations. I secured a junior analyst position at a mid-tier firm called Sterling & Vance, earning a salary of $58,500, a sum Julian spent on weekends in Ibiza. My workspace was a cubicle the size of my former walk-in closet, positioned directly under a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed with a 60 Hz drone. I worked 84 hours a week, processing data sets that colleagues found too dense to navigate, finding the microscopic errors in fiscal projections that everyone else ignored. I saved 70% of my income, living on a diet that was as clinical and repetitive as the algorithms I was refining in the dead of night. By the time 18 months had passed, I had accumulated $44,000 in a high-yield account, a modest sum by family standards. But it was the first money I had ever owned that didn't carry the weight of my father's conditional approval. I was no longer a shadow. I was a foundation being poured in the dark. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, I used the brass key Aunt Clara had slipped into my pocket to open safe deposit box number 412 at the First National Bank. I expected jewelry or perhaps a modest stack of bonds, but what I found was more devastating to the family legacy: a collection of 16 handwritten ledgers and 3 encrypted hard drives. These were the Oakmont Capital records Clara copied over 3 decades, documenting every skipped dividend and every unethical shortcut my father had taken to maintain the illusion of growth. There was also a letter, written on heavy cream stationery, that stated simply, "The person who holds the archives eventually holds the kingdom. Do not spend this currency until the interest is high enough to bankrupt them all." I didn't feel a rush of vengeance. I felt the cold, familiar weight of responsibility. I realized then that Clara hadn't just been an eccentric relative, she had been a silent archivist preparing for the inevitable collapse of a king. I founded my own consulting firm, Meridian Risk, using my savings and a name without the Thorne lineage. I operated out of a shared workspace where the coffee was burnt and the chairs were uncomfortable, but the data I produced was surgical in its precision. I utilized patterns I had discovered in Aunt Clara's ledgers to predict market shifts that larger firms were too bloated to notice, slowly building a reputation for being the silent oracle of mid-market acquisitions. By 2022, Meridian had secured 11 major clients, including 3 of my father's most aggressive competitors, unaware of the source of their reports. I charged $350 an hour, a rate that allowed me to move into a quiet, high-rise apartment where I could finally look down at the city without feeling like I was drowning in its noise. My father was still celebrating Julian's superficial victories, completely unaware that his daughter was now the primary architect of his rival's success. Aunt Clara continued to send correspondence every 6 months, always through a post office box in a different district to ensure the paper trail remained cold. Her letters never contained affection. Instead, they were filled with specific stock symbols, timestamps of board meetings, and the names of disgruntled executives within the Thorne organization. One letter, dated November 12, 2023, contained nothing but a clipping of Julian named Visionary of the Year by a business journal, with the word hollow written in Clara's sharp, elegant cursive across his forehead. I kept that clipping in the same leather-bound ledger where I recorded my own firm's growing capital, now exceeding $8 million. I was no longer struggling to survive. I was waiting for the market to reach the exact point of volatility where my father's arrogance would finally exceed his liquidity. The irony was that the more Julian failed upward, the more my father relied on external consulting to mask the structural rot I was quietly documenting from afar. The connection finally solidified in early 2024 when Oakmont Capital, desperate to salvage a failing European merger, reached out to the premier risk assessment firm in the region, Meridian Risk. My father's chief of staff contacted my office, requesting a consultation for a $200 million project, unaware that the ERV Thorn on the partnership agreement was the daughter they had discarded. I remember sitting in my office, a space of glass and steel where the light hit the floor at a precise 45-degree angle, and listening to the recorded voicemail of my father praising the unparalleled clinical genius of my firm's previous work. He spoke with the same authoritative tone he had used to take my inheritance, but this time he was the one asking for a lifeline he couldn't afford. I didn't feel joy or a sense of triumph. I simply checked the time on my own Patek Philippe and prepared to give him exactly what he had asked for, a professional evaluation of his own demise. ATO 5, Ogatilo. The Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom was a vacuum of oxygen and 800 per ounce perfume when I stepped through the gilded doors at 8:14 p.m. The 60th anniversary gala of Thorn Enterprises was designed as a temple to Arthur's enduring ego, illuminated by 3 massive baccarat chandeliers that hummed with the same electric arrogance I had fled years ago. The air was a thick, cloying blend of imported white lilies and the sharp, metallic ozone of high society desperation. Waiters in white gloves moved with the synchronized precision of clockwork soldiers, carrying silver trays of Krug Clos d'Ambonnet that cost $2,500 a bottle. I smoothed the lapel of my bespoke midnight blue blazer, feeling the familiar weight of my encrypted phone in my pocket. To the 300 guests sipping champagne, I was merely the black sheep allowed back for a moment of performative family unity. To me, the room was a crime scene of wasted potential, and I was the lead investigator, recording every gold-leafed detail before the inevitable collapse. My invitation had placed me at table 42, a circular island of white linen positioned exactly 64 feet from the main stage, wedged between the swinging service doors and a towering floral arrangement that smelled faintly of rot. From this vantage point, I could see the back of Julian's head, his hair perfectly gelled, reflecting the stage lights like polished obsidian. Arthur sat at table 1, surrounded by the governors and tech titans he cultivated like rare, expensive orchids. The hierarchy was as rigid as it had been at Oakmont Manor. The closer you were to the light, the more valuable your blood was deemed to be. I watched a busboy drop a dessert fork near my chair, the silver clattering against the marble floor, with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the practiced silence of the room. No one at the inner-circled tables flinched. To them, the noise at the edges was just static, a minor inconvenience in the grand symphony of their own importance. I sipped a glass of mineral water, the ice cubes clicking against the crystal with a rhythmic precision that mirrored my own heartbeat. At 9:02 p.m., Arthur stood up, the room falling into a hush so profound I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. He adjusted the microphone, his hands, decorated with a 10-carat signet ring, steady as he prepared to deliver the keynote address. He spoke of legacy as if it were a tangible substance, something he had forged through sheer will and the God-given talent of his male heirs. He mentioned the recent miracle turnaround of the European merger, a $200 million deal that had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy just 4 months prior. He didn't mention Meridian Risk, the anonymous firm that had provided the 84-page surgical analysis that saved the transaction. In his narrative, the salvation of Thorn Enterprises was a purely internal triumph, a victory of the Thorn bloodline over the chaotic forces of a volatile global market. Success is not merely about data. Arthur's voice boomed through the Bose sound system, resonating with the authority of a man who had never been told no. It is about the instinct to lead, the courage to seize the moment when others are paralyzed by doubt. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until it landed on Julian, who straightened his tie with a smirk that was as empty as it was rehearsed. I watched the way the light hit the gold embroidery on Julian's lapel, a custom design that cost more than my first year's rent in that 4th Street studio. Arthur began to recount the strategic brilliance Julian had displayed during the final negotiations in Brussels. He attributed the discovery of the 3% fiscal leak, the exact leak I had identified in my third report for Meridian, entirely to Julian's innate financial intuition. The lie was so seamless, so comfortably worn, that the room erupted in a polite, synchronized wave of applause that felt like a physical weight. The trigger wasn't the theft of my intellectual labor. I had expected them to claim my work as their own the moment they signed the Meridian contract. The breaking point arrived at 9:18 p.m. when Arthur signaled for the house lights to dim, a single spotlight focusing on a large, R-veiled frame on the stage. He announced that to commemorate this anniversary, he was establishing the Julian Thorne Foundation for Global Leadership, endowed with the $50 million surplus generated by the European merger. He then added, with a cold, dismissive glance toward Table 42, that true leadership requires a foundation of character that some branches of this family simply failed to grow. The room went silent, the insult hanging in the air like a cloud of poison gas. He was publicly defining my exclusion as a moral failure, a character flaw that justified the original theft of my trust fund and my subsequent erasure from the family's public history and future legacy. Julian stood up to accept the honorary plaque, his footsteps echoing on the wooden stage with a hollow, rhythmic thud. He didn't just accept the praise. He leaned into the microphone and joked about how some people are born to build empires, while others are born to simply watch them from the sidelines. He looked directly at me, his eyes bright with a cruel, infantile satisfaction that revealed the true depth of his insecurity. He knew the data wasn't his. He knew he had spent the last 6 months struggling to understand the very reports he was now being honored for. Yet, in that moment, bolstered by Arthur's public endorsement, he believed his own lie. The silence that had been my armor for 28 years suddenly felt like a burial shroud, tight and suffocating. I realized then that my father hadn't just taken my money or my career. He was attempting to rewrite my very existence into a cautionary tale of mediocrity. At 9:34 p.m., Julian made his way toward the back of the room, the honorary plaque tucked under his arm like a trophy. He stopped at Table 42, the scent of his expensive cologne, a $300 blend of oud and sandalwood, preceding him. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and whispered so softly that only I could hear the venom in his voice. "Dad says you can stay for the dessert course, Elena, but don't get too comfortable. We wouldn't want the staff to think you're one of the guests." He laughed, a short, barking sound that didn't reach his eyes, and tapped the edge of the plaque against the table. I looked at his hands, the soft, uncalloused fingers of a man who had never worked an 80-hour week in his life. The 19th century French regulator in my mind stopped ticking. The sound of the ballroom faded into a dull, underwater hum as the final internal barrier of my patience disintegrated. Arthur joined him a moment later, his presence radiating the cold, clinical authority that had once terrified me. He didn't sit down. He stood over the table, his shadow falling across my half-empty glass of water like a dark omen. He told me that my presence tonight was a mercy, a chance for me to see what a Thorne could achieve when they weren't distracted by academic vanity and petty resentment. He spoke about Aunt Clara, calling her a cautionary ghost who had wasted her life in the shadows, and warned me that I was following the same path to obsolescence. He mentioned that he had officially finalized the paperwork to remove my name from the family archives, ensuring that even the record of my birth would eventually be moved to the inactive files. He believed he was delivering a final, decisive blow to my spirit, unaware that he was actually cutting the last thread that bound me to his crumbling kingdom. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my glass or look away from his steel-gray eyes. Instead, I stood up with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to catch them both off guard. The movement was silent, my charcoal silk trousers rustling with a faint, expensive sound that spoke of a wealth they couldn't yet fathom. I felt the vibration of my phone in my pocket, a notification that the final transfer of Meridian's majority shares into a shell company controlled by Aunt Clara's trust had just been verified. The clock at the Pierre Hotel showed exactly 9:47 p.m. I looked at Arthur, noting the broken capillaries on his nose and the slight tremor in his signet-ringed hand. He wasn't a king. He was an aging man trying to hide the structural rot of his company with gold leaf and insults. The air in the ballroom, previously suffocating, suddenly felt crystalline and cold, the sharp clarity of a winter morning before a massive storm. "You're right about one thing, Father," I said, my voice carrying a terrifyingly calm resonance that cut through the background noise of the gala. "The instinct to lead is rare, and the courage to see the truth is even rarer. I didn't wait for his response, nor did I look at Julian's confused, smirking face as I began to walk away. I moved with a measured, rhythmic pace, my spine perfectly straight, the sound of my heels on the marble floor the only rhythm that mattered. I didn't run, and I didn't look back at the stage where the Thorn legacy was being celebrated with stolen data and hollow promises. As I reached the exit, I felt the brass key in my pocket, the key to the final safe deposit box that held the documents to bankrupt them both. What they didn't know was that the gala wasn't the beginning of Julian's reign. It was the funeral for everything they thought they owned. The silence that followed my departure was not broken by a shout, but by the synchronized chime of 84 black market iPads distributed to the primary investors at Table 1. At precisely 10:02 p.m., the digital ink on their screens refreshed, revealing the final, audited disclosure of the European merger they had just celebrated with stolen champagne. The air in the Pierre Hotel ballroom, once cloying with lilies, suddenly turned sharp with the scent of ozone and the cold, metallic sweat of men realizing they were holding worthless paper. Arthur stood frozen, his hand still gripping the honorary plaque meant for Julian, while the lead director, Marcus Vane, adjusted his spectacles and stared at the name Meridian Risk at the top of the foreclosure notice. The hum of the chandeliers seemed to drop an octave, vibrating through the floorboards like a warning bell that only I had heard coming for years. No one looked at the stage anymore. They looked at their devices. Arthur's face underwent a structural collapse that no amount of expensive tailoring or Scotch-aged confidence could mask, his skin turning the gray of wet pavement under the ballroom's spotlight. He tried to speak, but the microphone let out a high-pitched, agonizing squeal that echoed the internal panic radiating from Julian, who was still holding his celebratory glass like a shield. Marcus Vane stood up, his voice cutting through the rising murmur with the clinical precision of a blade, demanding to know why the majority shares of Thorn Enterprises had been pledged as collateral to a shell company called Clara's Legacy. The name hung in the air like a ghost, cold and undeniable, as the digital ledger on the screens detailed 30 years of systematic embezzlement and fiscal rot that my father had carefully hidden behind Julian's empty smiles. I didn't stop walking toward the exit, my heels clicking against the marble with the steady, rhythmic finality of a closing door. Julian stumbled toward the edge of the stage, his $1,000 loafers slipping on a stray rose petal, as the realization began to seep into his hollow expression that he was the architect of nothing. The investors were now standing, their chairs scraping against the floor with a sound like grinding teeth, while Arthur's chief of staff frantically checked his own phone for a signal that wasn't there. I turned slightly at the doorway, my silhouette framed by the gold-leafed arch, and watched as the lead analyst from Sterling & Vance pointed at the E.E.V. Thorn signature on the screen, identifying me as the sole owner of Meridian Risk. The irony was a physical presence in the room, heavy and suffocating for the men who had spent 28 years trying to make me invisible. They had praised the clinical genius of my firm while insulting the daughter who stood at the edge of their table, never connecting the data to the woman. The data doesn't lie, Arthur, even when the lineage does, and right now the evidence is illuminating the exact cost of your arrogance, I said, my voice carrying across the ballroom with a terrifying, low-frequency clarity that silenced the panicked board members. I didn't raise my tone. I spoke with the clinical distance of a woman who had already processed their failure years before it became a public record for the press. Arthur's hands began to shake, the signet ring clicking against the mahogany podium with a rhythmic, frantic sound that mirrored his disintegrating heartbeat. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, he didn't see a functional shadow or a disappointment. He saw the predator he had inadvertently trained in his own library. Behind him, the screen displayed the 84 transfer authorizations from 2018, now cross-referenced with the Meridian acquisition funds, proving that I hadn't just survived his theft, I had used it to buy his ground. The board of directors moved away from Arthur as if he were a contagion, their professional loyalty evaporating under the heat of the forensic evidence, now illuminating the entire room in a cold blue light. Julian began to stammer, trying to explain that the Belgian fiscal leak was his discovery, but Marcus Vane simply held up a printed copy of my original report, time-stamped 6 weeks before Julian had even boarded the plane to Brussels. The laughter that had been directed at me earlier was now replaced by a profound, suffocating embarrassment that filled the vacuum of the ballroom. I watched as the waiter who had dropped the fork earlier stepped forward to clear table 42, his movements the only normal thing in a world that was currently being dismantled by its own hubris. Arthur reached out toward the microphone one last time, his mouth opening to deliver another mercy. But no sound came out except the dry, hollow rasp of a defeated king. Aunt Clara appeared at the side of the stage, her lavender-scented presence a sharp contrast to the cloying rot of the floral arrangements, her eyes holding the grim satisfaction of a master architect watching a controlled demolition. She didn't say a word to her brother, but she handed Marcus Vane the final leather-bound ledger, the one she had been keeping for 30 years, which contained the original signatures of my grandmother's trust. The document proved that the reallocation of my doctoral funds was not just a moral failing, but a legal breach that triggered an immediate forfeiture of the estate's voting rights to the primary beneficiary, me. Arthur sat down in the velvet chair he had occupied all night, his posture breaking as the structural reality of his obsolescence finally settled into his bones. He looked at Julian, then at the ledger, realizing that the cautionary ghost had actually been the person keeping the only record that mattered while he was building his hollow monument. "I'm not staying for the dessert course, Father, as the staff is currently busy preparing the transition files for my arrival tomorrow morning," I stated, the words falling into the silence like heavy, polished stones. I didn't wait for a reply or a plea for compassion. I knew that for a man like Arthur, the loss of his reputation was a far greater pain than the loss of his daughter. I adjusted the strap of my charcoal briefcase, feeling the cold weight of the brass key against my palm, and walked out of the Pierre Hotel without a single backward glance at the wreckage. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was the only rhythm in the foyer, a measured and steady pulse that signaled the end of the Thorne era and the beginning of something built on truth. Outside, the night air was crisp, and 94 degrees of resentment were replaced by the clinical, cooling breeze of justice that arrives when you finally stop asking for permission to exist. At exactly 7:14 a.m. the following Monday, a courier in a gray uniform delivered a 68-page injunction to the front gates of Oakmont Manor, the heavy iron bars vibrating with a low, metallic groan as they opened. The morning air was 48 degrees, crisp and unforgiving, smelling of damp cedar and the ozone that precedes a significant atmospheric shift in the Hudson Valley. My father was sitting in the breakfast nook, his silk robe slightly askew, staring at a silver spoon that reflected the hollow, gray circles beneath his eyes. He didn't reach for the envelope. He simply watched as the courier placed it on the white linen tablecloth, next to a crystal bowl of untouched grapefruit. The document, filed under the name of Meridian Risk, detailed the immediate freezing of 14 offshore accounts totaling $82 million. It was the first time in 30 years that the house was truly silent, a silence that felt like the structural failure of a long-neglected foundation. Arthur spent the next 84 hours inside his mahogany-paneled study, the only sound being the rhythmic, dry click of his Mont Blanc pen as he attempted to find a loophole in the Meridian foreclosure. The room smelled of stale tobacco and the sharp, medicinal scent of high-end gin, a bottle of Tanqueray No. 10 sitting half-empty on the 17th-century desk. Outside, the world was already moving at a different frequency. The Thorne brand name now a topic of 14-page editorial spreads in every financial journal from Zurich to New York. The 19th-century French regulator clock on the mantel struck 11:45 p.m., a sound that resonated with the finality of a closing coffin lid. Julian was in the basement media room, his eyes fixed on a muted television screen that scrolled 82 news alerts per minute, each one a separate, digital blow to his perceived legacy. They were no longer the architects of their own future. They were merely the observers of a demolition that had been planned 6 years ago. At 2:42 p.m. on Tuesday, Julian entered the Union Club, his $1,000 loafers clicking against the polished oak floors as he approached the bar. The air smelled of expensive leather and aged single malt, a familiar sanctuary that suddenly felt 3 degrees colder as the bartender, a man named Marcus who had served the Thorne family for 14 years, lowered his gaze. Julian ordered a $42 glass of Macallan 18R, sliding his black American Express Centurion card across the marble counter with a flick of practiced arrogance. The Verifone terminal emitted a single, high-pitched beep that sliced through the hushed conversation of the room like a razor blade. The word "declined" appeared in cold, neon-red letters across the screen. The transaction for $42 failing for the first time in Julian's 32 years of existence. Marcus didn't apologize. He simply slid the card back across the marble, the plastic making a dry, scratching sound that echoed the emptiness of Julian's suddenly frozen trust fund accounts. The following Wednesday, the board of directors convened at 10:14 a.m. in the glass and steel conference room on the 44th floor, the air vibrating with the 60 hertz hum of the cooling system. 14 men and 3 women sat around a 30-foot table of polished quartz, their eyes fixed on the 75-inch monitor that displayed the forensic audit results from Meridian Risk. The data was surgical, revealing 84 separate instances of fiscal misrepresentation and a $12.4 million gap in the capital reserves that Arthur had sworn were untouchable. No one spoke for 17 minutes, the only sound being the rustle of high-weight bond paper and the soft, electronic ping of incoming messages from concerned primary investors. At 10:31 a.m., Marcus Vane moved for an immediate vote of no confidence, his hand steady as he raised it into the cold, clinical light of the boardroom. The motion passed 16-1, the single dissenting vote belonging to a cousin whose own dividends were currently being scrutinized for 18 separate tax irregularities. I moved into my new headquarters at 405 Park Avenue, exactly 14 days after the gala, a space of brushed aluminum and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the gray, rhythmic pulse of the city. My office was minimalist, containing only a single desk of black obsidian and a chair of supple charcoal leather that cost $11,000 and offered the exact lumbar support required for 16-hour shifts. The air smelled of nothing, no lilies, no tobacco, no stale perfume, just the clean, neutral scent of high-efficiency air filtration and the faint ozone of 19 active monitors. My chief of staff, a woman named Sarah with 3 degrees in forensic accounting, brought me a black coffee at 8:05 a.m. every morning without saying a single word. I had 42 employees now, each one hand-picked for their ability to navigate the 14 separate legal jurisdictions where the Thorn assets were currently being liquidated. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I felt the calm, calibrated efficiency of a machine that had finally been assembled correctly. On a Thursday evening at 6:42 p.m., my private line lit up with a call from Arthur's senior legal counsel, a man named Elias who had earned a flat fee of $400,000 a year to protect the Thorn family's secrets. He spoke with the strained, 60-decibel softness of a man who knew his bargaining position had eroded by 84% since the previous Sunday. He suggested a private family summit at a neutral location, hinting that my father was prepared to offer a public apology in exchange for a $25 million lifeline to prevent the foreclosure of Oakmont Manor. I listened to the rhythmic hum of the phone line, noting the slight tremor in his voice as he described Arthur's deteriorating health and our emotional toll the litigation was taking on my mother. I didn't respond for 12 seconds, allowing the silence to stretch until the static on the line became a physical weight. I then replied that my terms were fixed at 100% asset disclosure and hung up at 6:44 p.m. Aunt Clara moved her entire library, 16,000 volumes and 84 linear feet of original Thorn ledgers, into the east wing of my new headquarters by the end of the first month. She walked through the glass corridors at 9 a.m. every morning, her lavender-scented presence a quiet, 90-decibel reminder of the 30 years she spent recording the family's structural rot in silence. She didn't offer me hugs or emotional validation. She simply handed me a single, leather-bound index that cross-referenced every offshore entity my father had created since 1994. Her hands, though thin and marked with the spots of her 72 years, were as steady as the 60 Hz frequency of the building's power grid. We spent our Tuesday afternoons in a shared silence, sipping tea that cost $84 per ounce and reviewing the 14 separate lawsuits now pending against Julian's various vanity projects. She was the one who reminded me that justice is not a feeling, but a mathematical result of waiting until the interest on a debt is finally high enough to consume the borrower. The Sunday edition of the Wall Street Journal featured a 4-page spread on the Meridian takeover, the headline printed in bold, 36-point font that could be read from 5 feet away at any newsstand in Manhattan. The article detailed the 84-page forensic report and the $12.4 million embezzlement, framing my father's A Legacy as a 30-year exercise in high society performance art. Photographs of Oakmont Manor, with its 60-foot iron gates now adorned with legal foreclosure notices, appeared on 18 separate news sites by noon that same day. The Thorn brand, once valued at $480 million, had plummeted to a liquidation value of barely $64 million within 28 days of the gala revelation. I read the coverage while sitting on my obsidian desk, noting the clinical accuracy of the reporting and the 82% drop in the company's stock price. There was no mention of my name in the primary headlines. I remained the E.V. Thorn in the fine print, a silent 60 Hz presence behind the systematic dismantling of a kingdom. Julian arrived at my building on Friday at 4:18 p.m., wearing a rumpled gray suit and a $60 tie that looked like a relic from his former life of unearned luxury. He stood in the lobby, his presence a 50 decibel disruption to the quiet efficiency of the 405 Park Avenue security team, demanding to see his sister, as if the word carried some residual weight. The security guard, a former Marine named Davis, stood 6'2" and blocked the elevator bank with the immovable precision of a concrete wall. Julian's face was flushed, the sweat on his forehead reflecting the 48 fluorescent bulbs of the lobby's ceiling, as he shouted about family loyalty and his 64% interest in the remaining trust funds. Davis didn't flinch. He simply checked the 4:20 p.m. visitor log and informed Julian that his name was on the 84-person permanent exclusion list. My brother was escorted out of the building by two men in $90 uniforms, his protests fading into the gray, rhythmic noise of the Manhattan afternoon traffic. By the middle of the second month, the final audit of Thorne Enterprises revealed that 84% of the growth reported in the 2022 fiscal year was actually a clever reallocation of 72 separate pension funds. The total deficit was revised to $48 million, a figure that sat on my screen in bold, red 12-point font as I sipped my 9 a.m. black coffee. Each transfer was time-stamped, most occurring at 3:15 a.m. on the third Tuesday of every month, a pattern of desperation that revealed my father's true internal state during his most successful year. I shared this data with the 14 primary investors, who were now suing for a total of $82 million in damages and legal fees. The spreadsheets were beautiful in their complexity, a 68-column map of a man who had spent 3 decades trying to outrun his own mediocrity. I didn't feel the need for vengeance. I simply watched as the numbers reached their inevitable zero-sum conclusion, the structural rot of the company finally exposed to the cold, clinical light of the law. Reports from the housekeeper at Oakmont Manor indicated that Arthur had retreated to the third-floor library, a room of 64 square feet that smelled of dust, and the 60-year-old binding glue of his unread law books. He wore the same charcoal sweater for 14 consecutive days, his weight dropping by 18 pounds as he survived on black coffee and the $84 a bottle scotch he had once used only for celebrations. He had stopped wearing his Patek Philippe, the watch sitting on a bedside table next to a stack of 14 unreturned summonses from the Securities and Exchange Commission. His voice, once a 80-decibel instrument of command, had shrunk to a 40-decibel rasp that was barely audible over the hum of the house's heating system. He spent his afternoons staring at the 60-foot gates, watching as 18 separate process servers attempted to gain entry to deliver the final foreclosure documents. He wasn't a king in exile. He was a 72-year-old man, realizing that the shadow he had tried to erase was now the only light left in the room. On a Tuesday evening in late November, a handwritten invitation on 84-pound cream cardstock was delivered to my office, requesting my presence at a reconciliation dinner at the Harvard Club at 7 p.m. The script was my mother's, the elegant 40-degree slant of her letters concealing a 30-year history of covering for my father's various moral and financial failures. She spoke of the holidays and the unbreakable bond of blood, her words printed with the same practiced grace as the invitations to the gala that had started this sequence. The air in the room, when I read the card, was exactly 68 degrees, the silent hum of the 90% efficient ventilation system, the only accompaniment to the ticking of my own 19th-century regulator clock. I didn't feel a pang of nostalgia or a flicker of guilt. I simply saw the card as a desperate opening move in a 64-step game that had already reached its endgame. I didn't respond to the invitation. I simply placed it in the inactive folder on my obsidian desk at exactly 6:42 p.m. At 9 a.m. the following morning, I instructed my assistant to email a 14-page PDF to my mother's private address, the document titled Terms of Engagement for Future Correspondence. It was not a letter, but a 94-clause contract that specified the exact conditions under which any member of the Thorne family could contact me or the Meridian Risk offices. The terms included a mandatory 84% disclosure of all remaining hidden assets and a signed confession regarding the 2018 trust fund theft, witnessed by 2 independent notaries and a court reporter. The email was sent at 9:02 a.m., the 60 Hz hum of the server room echoing the clinical finality of the conditions I was imposing on our relationship. I specified that any attempt to bypass these terms would result in an immediate $10 million increase in the civil damages I was seeking through the Manhattan Supreme Court. I didn't want their love or their apologies. I wanted a clean, documented record of the truth, formatted in 12-point Times New Roman and filed in triplicate for the family archives. Oakmont Manor was officially listed for sale on December 14th at 9:15 a.m., The asking price of $42 million, reflecting the 28% decrease in market value caused by the family's public disgrace. The listing included 94 photographs of the 64-acre estate, each image a high-definition record of the hollow luxury I had navigated for 28 years. The mahogany table where I had been ignored was highlighted in photo number 14. The lighting adjusted to show the grain of the wood, but not the 84 years of resentment absorbed by its surface. 14 potential buyers toured the property in the first week, their $60,000 SUVs crunching the gravel of the driveway where I had stood with my single suitcase in 2018. My father was permitted to remain in the guest house, a 1,400-square-foot structure at the edge of the property, while the main house was staged with 98 pieces of rented, neutral furniture. The air in the manor was finally 68 degrees, but the warmth was as artificial as the smiles in the Thorne family portraits. Julian's presence on social media vanished on January 4th at 11:14 p.m., his final post being a 64-word defense of his visionary leadership that received 82% negative comments within the first 14 minutes. He moved into a $1,400 a month apartment in a district he once mocked, a space of 64 square feet that smelled of cheap paint and the 60 hertz hum of a refrigerator from the 1990s. He was spotted at a local dive bar at 2:05 a.m. on a Tuesday, drinking a $12 pitcher of domestic beer and telling anyone who would listen about the $64 million deal he had almost closed in Brussels. His $60,000 car had been repossessed 14 days earlier, replaced by a used sedan that sounded like a bag of loose silver every time he started the engine. He no longer checked his Rolex. He had sold it to a pawn shop for $8,000 to pay the retainer for a criminal defense attorney who specialized in 72-count indictments. He was no longer a Thorne. He was a 32-year-old man struggling to understand a world where his last name didn't function as a universal currency. The Thorne household staff, including the head chef who had earned a $94,000 salary, resigned en masse on January 18th at 4:00 p.m., citing 14 months of unpaid bonuses and a general atmosphere of 60% toxic uncertainty. I hired the chef, a man named Rene, to manage the executive dining room at Meridian Risk, offering him a 30% raise and a 60 hertz workspace that smelled of fresh herbs instead of scorched butter. He arrived at 7:15 a.m. every morning, preparing 16 different types of $84 a pound coffee for my analysts as they dismantled the final layers of the Thorne corporate structure. The maids and the groundskeepers were also absorbed into the property management firm I had established to maintain my growing portfolio of 84 commercial buildings across Manhattan. They didn't speak of my father or Julian. They simply performed their duties with a 60-decibel efficiency that reflected the stability of their new $12.4 million pension fund, the loyalty that Arthur had tried to buy with arrogance. I secured with a simple 68-clause employment contract and a fair, market-rate salary. I chaired my first board meeting of the restructured Thorne Global, now a subsidiary of Meridian Risk, on February 12th at 9:00 a.m., wearing a charcoal silk suit that cost $4,000 and fit with surgical precision. The 17 board members sat in 60 hertz silence as I presented the 14-page strategy for returning the company to a 64% growth rate within 28 months. I spoke with a clinical, 40-decibel resonance, my eyes fixed on the 75-inch monitor that displayed the 68 columns of the new, transparent fiscal ledger. There were no jokes, no anecdotes about legacy, and no mention of the 84 years of family history that had nearly destroyed the organization's structural integrity. I moved through the agenda in exactly 84 minutes, the sound of my Montblanc pen clicking shut at 10:24 a.m., signaling the end of the meeting and the beginning of a 64-step implementation plan. The directors didn't look through me. They looked at the data I presented, recognizing that the woman at the head of the table was the only architect capable of rebuilding the kingdom. At 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, two workmen in $90 uniforms removed Arthur's portrait from the lobby of the corporate headquarters, the 6-foot gilded frame leaving a 94-inch rectangular shadow on the gray marble wall. The air in the lobby was exactly 68 degrees. The silent hum of the 90% efficient ventilation system, the only accompaniment to the metallic clatter of the 14-gauge hanging wire being coiled. The portrait was moved to the basement storage facility, a space of 84 square feet, where it was placed next to 82 crates of obsolete marketing materials and 64 broken monitors from the 1990s. I watched from the 44th floor mezzanine, noting the clinical efficiency of the removal and the way the gray marble wall seemed to breathe once the 60-pound weight of my father's ego was gone. I didn't order a replacement. I left the space empty, a 94-inch monument to the fact that leadership is not about the face on the wall, but the data on the screen and the 60 hertz pulse of the company's internal integrity. A cousin named Philip, who had once sat at table 14 during the Sunday dinners and ignored me for 28 years, attempted to mediate a settlement on February 24th at 4:15 p.m. He sat in my obsidian-walled lobby, his $60,000 car idling at the curb as he waited 42 minutes for an audience that I had already scheduled for exactly 14 minutes. He spoke of forgiveness and the 84-year history of the Thorn name, his voice a 60-decibel blend of practiced charm and the 80% desperation of a man whose own dividends were currently being scrutinized for 18 separate tax irregularities. He suggested that I be the bigger person and release the $14 million hold on the family trust in exchange for a seat on the honorary foundation board. I looked at the clock on the wall, a 19th-century French regulator ticking at 60 beats per minute, and informed him that my bigness was currently being measured by the 94-clause forensic audit I was conducting into his own company. He left the building at 4:29 p.m., his charm replaced by a 60% increase in his heart rate. Our family meetings were now conducted exclusively through 16 encrypted Zoom links, the 60 hertz hum of the digital connection, the only remaining link between the 94 branches of the Thorn lineage. My mother would log in at 2:00 p.m., her face illuminated by the 48 fluorescent bulbs of her temporary apartment, while Julian appeared from a room that smelled of 60-cent-a-gallon paint. I would present the 14-point agenda for the liquidation of the remaining estate assets, my voice a clinical, 40-decibel rasp that left no room for 84 years of emotional baggage or petty resentment. We discussed property taxes, legal retainers, and the 64% decrease in the family's net worth with the same detachment one might use to discuss the weather in a remote province. There were no tears, no shouts of betrayal, and no mention of the 68-page injunction that had started the process. There was only the rhythmic, 60-beat-per-minute ticking of the clock in my office. The Thorn family had finally become what Arthur always wanted it to be, a single, functional organism. At 3:14 p.m. on a Wednesday, my mother's private collection of jewels, 94 pieces including an 82-carat diamond necklace, was delivered to my office for appraisal by a firm that charged $800 an hour. The air in the room was 68 degrees, smelling of the 84-pound cream cardstock used for the inventory lists and the 90% pure alcohol used to clean the stones. My mother had sent them with a 14-word note asking for a modest advance on her monthly stipend, her 60-degree slant of handwriting appearing 3% more erratic than it had in November. I watched as the appraiser used a 60 hertz ultraviolet lamp to verify the 82 separate facets of the Thorn diamond, a stone that had once symbolized the 84 years of our family's dominance. I didn't feel a sense of triumph as I looked at the glittering pile on my obsidian desk. I simply authorized a $14,000 transfer and filed the 94-page appraisal in the collateral folder. The jewels were no longer symbols of status. They were merely 82-carat units of currency. Julian was photographed by a tabloid on March 12th at 8:05 p.m., standing in line at a 99-cent grocery store while wearing a 14-year-old trench coat and a $60 pair of generic sneakers. The image was shared 18,000 times on social media, the 84 comments per minute reflecting the public's clinical fascination with the 64% collapse of a once untouchable heir. He was carrying a single bag containing 72-cent packs of ramen and a $14 bottle of wine that tasted of 60% synthetic additives and 84 years of regret. His 64-square-foot apartment was located 4 blocks from the studio I had occupied in 2018, a geographic irony that sat in my mind with the 60 hertz hum of a perfectly resolved equation. He no longer looked at his reflection in silver spoons. He looked at the 84-page legal indictment that was scheduled for a 60-day trial in the Manhattan Supreme Court. He was finally experiencing the invisibility he had once imposed on me, a 60-decibel silence that was the loudest sound in his new reality. The final meeting with Arthur occurred on March 14th at 2:00 p.m. in the guest house. The air 68 degrees and smelling of 90% pure cleaning fluid, and the 84-year-old dust of his unread ledgers. He sat in a $1,400 armchair, his hands shaking at a 60 hertz frequency as he signed the 68-page document that officially transferred the final Thorn patents to Meridian Risk. He didn't look at me for the first 14 minutes, his eyes fixed on the 94-inch shadow on the wall where his portrait had once hung in his mind's eye. When he finally spoke, his voice was a 40-decibel whisper, asking if I had planned this demolition from the moment I left in 2018 with my single suitcase and $1,200. I didn't respond for 12 seconds, allowing the 60 beat per minute ticking of the regulator clock to provide the only answer he deserved. I then told him that I hadn't planned his destruction. I had simply documented his structural failure and waited for the 64% inevitable collapse. Aunt Clara and I stood on the 44th floor balcony at 6 p.m. on the first anniversary of the gala, the 90-degree wind from the East River smelling of ozone and the 60 hertz hum of the city. We didn't speak for 14 minutes, the only sound being the 90% silent rhythmic pulse of the traffic 84 stories below our feet. She handed me a 84-year-old fountain pen, the one she had used to record the first entries in the Thorn archives, and a single, leather-bound ledger with 84 blank pages. The air was 48 degrees, crisp and clinical, as we watched the lights of the 64-acre Oakmont estate dim for the final time before the new owners took possession. We were two women who had spent a combined 64 years in the shadows, recording the 84 separate lies that had built a kingdom of dust and hollow mahogany. There was no need for 94-word speeches or 82% emotional displays. The silence we shared was a 60 hertz frequency of peace that was more valuable than the trust we had dismantled. The press began calling me the architect of the new Thorn. By the middle of the third month, the 84-page profiles in business journals highlighting the 64% increase in the company's structural efficiency. I didn't participate in the interviews, nor did I allow the 94% accurate photographs of my obsidian-walled office to be shared with the 14 primary news agencies. I had not been destroyed by the 84 years of erasure. I had been tempered by the 60 hertz hum of the 4th Street studio and the 94-clause legal contracts I had drafted in the dark. The transformation was not an emotional event, but a 94-step process of removing the 64 pounds of dead weight from my identity and replacing it with the clinical, dull, 40-decibel resonance of power. I no longer looked for my reflection in the eyes of men like Arthur. I looked at the 84-column fiscal ledgers and the 64% growth rates that were the only metrics of my existence. I had not won a revenge game. I had simply completed a 64-step migration. The Thorn Global headquarters was renamed Meridian Center on April 4th at 9 a.m. The 94-inch rectangular shadow in the lobby finally covered by a 64-inch digital monitor, displaying the 60 hertz real-time market data. The air in the building was 68 degrees, smelling of $84 a pound coffee and the 90% neutral scent of a 72-person team of forensic analysts and structural engineers. I hired 84 new employees in the first quarter, each one selected for their ability to maintain a 60-decibel level of professional efficiency and a 94% accuracy rate in their fiscal projections. We operated as a single, 94-clause organism, free from the 64-year-old burden of family drama and the 84% toxic uncertainty of Arthur's former regime. The new era was not characterized by 82% loud celebrations or 94-word mission statements. It was defined by the 60 hertz hum of the server room and the $14.8 million monthly revenue targets we achieved with clinical precision. I was finally the majority shareholder of a company that functioned with clarity. The 16 original Thorn ledgers were placed in a climate-controlled vault at 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The 84-year-old paper, preserved at exactly 68 degrees and 48% humidity. These were the documents that had fueled the 64% collapse of my father's kingdom, an 84-page record of every skipped dividend and every 94-clause ethical shortcut he had taken since 1994. I spent 42 minutes inside the vault every Friday, reviewing the 84 separate entries that Aunt Clara had recorded in her 90-decibel silence. The legacy was not a $82 million trust fund or a 64-acre estate. It was the 60 hertz truth that had been maintained in the shadows, while the king was busy building his hollow monuments. I realized that the person who holds the archives truly does hold the kingdom, provided they have the 64-step patience to wait until the 84% interest on the truth is finally high enough to consume the liars. The vault was a 94-square-foot sanctuary of clinical reality, a 60 hertz frequency of peace that was my only inheritance. I returned to the breakfast nook at Oakmont Manor one last time on April 14th at 9 a.m., the air 68 degrees and smelling of the 90% pure cleaning fluid used to stage the 64-acre house for the final sale. I sat in the chair where I had stood in 2018 with my single suitcase and $1,200 deck. The mahogany table reflecting the 84 fluorescent bulbs of the new II 60 hertz lighting system. I remembered the exact weight of the air on the day my father signed the 84 transfer authorizations that erased my academic future and gave $42 million to Julian's vanity. The 19th century French regulator clock was still on the mantel, its 60 beat per minute ticking the only sound in the 64 square foot room where my erasure had been finalized. I didn't feel the 84% resentment of my youth. I felt the 60 hertz clarity of a woman who had used the $1,200 to buy the $64 million debt of the man who had stolen it. The reflection was clear. The final legal settlement was signed on April 18th at 4:15 p.m. A 94-page document that officially terminated the 84-year history of the Thorne Family Trust and distributed the remaining $14 million to the Meridian risk creditors. I signed my name 18 times, each stroke of my Mont Blanc pen a 60 hertz vibration that signaled the end of the 64-step liquidation process. Arthur was present via a 60 decibel encrypted link, his face a 94% accurate record of the 72 years of arrogance that had led to this 68-clause finality. He didn't speak for the 14 minutes it took to witness the signatures, the only sound being the 90% silent rhythmic pulse of the court reporter's stenograph machine. The settlement included a 94-clause permanent gag order and a 64% restriction on any future use of the Thorne name for commercial purposes. I walked out of the conference room at 4:29 p.m., the 60 hertz hum of the Meridian Center, the only sound in my head as I closed the 14-year-old folder. At 6:42 p.m. on a Thursday, I sat in my obsidian-walled office and measured my personal peace as a 60 hertz frequency of professional achievement and 94% structural integrity. The air was exactly 68 degrees, smelling of $84 a pound coffee and the 90% neutral scent of a perfectly resolved 84-column fiscal ledger. I had $42 million in my personal account and 84% control over a $64 million global organization that finally functioned without the 64-year-old burden of Thorne family drama. My victory was not a 94-word emotional display or a 82% loud celebration. It was the clinical, 40-decibel resonance of a life that was finally built on its own terms. I looked at the 64-inch monitor on the wall, noting the 60 hertz real-time growth of the 14 separate companies I now owned through a series of 94-clause shell entities. Peace was not a feeling. It was a 64-step mathematical result of removing every 94% toxic element from my environment and replacing it with the clarity of the truth. I closed the final leather-bound ledger on April 30th at 11:59 p.m., the 84-year-old paper making a 60-decibel dry scratching sound that echoed the 84 separate lies I had finally dismantled. The air in my apartment was 68 degrees, the 90% silent rhythmic pulse of the Manhattan night, the only accompaniment to the 60 beat per minute ticking of my regulator clock. I looked at the brass key to the safe deposit box, the key Aunt Clara had given me in 2018, and realized its 64-step purpose had been fulfilled with 94% accuracy. I was no longer the daughter at the far end of the mahogany table, nor was I the functional shadow at the edge of the 64-acre Thorne estate. I was a 44-year-old woman who had used the 84 separate insults of her past to build a 94-clause future of clinical, 60 hertz power. I didn't look back as I turned off the 64-watt lamp on my desk, the silence of the room finally reflecting the 94% perfect structural integrity of a life that was finally and completely my own. Today, at exactly 8:14 a.m., the light in my penthouse study hits the black obsidian desk at a precise 45-degree angle, illuminating the 84-year-old fountain pen Aunt Clara left me. The room is a constant 68 degrees, smelling only of rain-washed glass and the 90% pure white tea that costs $120 per ounce. There are no mahogany tables here, no service doors, and no cloying scent of lilies masking the rot of a failing dynasty. I spend my mornings reviewing the 64% growth charts of Meridian Center, noting the clinical efficiency of a company that operates without the 84-pound weight of a father's conditional approval. My reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window is sharp, the charcoal silk of my suit a 94% match for the gray Manhattan skyline. I have replaced the 84 years of Thorne family noise with a 60 hertz frequency of absolute, uninterrupted peace that requires no validation from ghosts. I recently authorized the final demolition of the guest house at Oakmont Manor, a 1,400-square-foot structure that had become a 60-decibel monument to Arthur's remaining bitterness. The 72-year-old man who once sat at the head of a 10-foot table now resides in a 64-square-foot assisted living suite that smells of 90% pure antiseptic and 84 years of wasted pride. Julian, I am told, is currently navigating a 60-day trial for 72 counts of fiscal fraud. His $60 ties a stark contrast to the $8,000 watches he used to pawn for temporary relevance. I do not visit, nor do I send the 14-page legal briefs they occasionally request through their court-appointed attorneys. My invisibility was once a source of 94% trauma, but today it is my most valuable asset. A 60 Hz camouflage that allows me to move through the world without the burden of a name that was never truly mine to carry. For those of you watching this who have spent 28 years being the shadow at the edge of someone else's spotlight, you already understand that survival is not a 94-word emotional outburst. It is a 64-step mathematical process of documentation, and the 90% silent patience required to wait for the interest on the truth to finally exceed the borrower's ability to pay. You know the exact weight of the brass key in your pocket and the 60 Hz hum of the digital clock at 4:05 a.m. when you were building a kingdom from the $1,158 they left you. Justice is not a 82% loud revenge. It is the clinical, 40-decibel resonance of a life that finally functions with structural integrity after the 84 separate lies have been dismantled. We don't ask for compassion or 82% public apologies because we have the 68-page forensic reports and the 84% majority shares that prove our value. The Thorn name has officially been moved to the inactive archives, a 94-inch rectangular shadow on a wall that no longer holds any power over my 64% daily reality. I do not look back at the 60-foot iron gates or the 84 years of resentment that were once the structural foundation of my existence. My future is a 94-clause contract of my own design, a 60 Hz frequency of power that arrived not because I fought for it, but because I was the only architect left standing when the dust of their collapse finally settled. The archives are now closed. The 84 entries recorded in 60-decibel silence finally reaching their zero-sum conclusion in the cold, clinical light of the present. Tell me, have you ever been forced to build your own throne because the one you were promised was built on a foundation of stolen data and 84 separate betrayals? Leave your story in the comments below.